Hello, this is an overview of economic development theory, regional economic development theory for our course in community leadership. So economic development is one of those activities that is often a major component of community development in any given community. And typically, economic development is a public-private partnerships. Oftentimes, there are community development corporations that focus solely on providing opportunities to grow the regional economy. In Bowling Green, there's the South Central Economic Development Organization that is a leg of the Bowling Green area, South Central Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Chamber of Commerce is a private organization that's a business membership-driven organization. Economic development arm of that organization is a public-private arm in that usually city and county government, rather than competing, will provide funding to create one organization that's a single point of contact that focuses on the development of the region in a unified manner with all the different governments that are involved. In many cases, it's a multi-county effort, as it is in South Central Kentucky. Other areas have city-oriented economic development agencies that are wholly private or wholly public. But most communities, most local communities, particularly the size of communities that we're looking at in the scope of this course, the size of Bowling Green, typically use a public-private partnership that is affiliated with chambers of commerce or a standalone development agency. When I worked in economic development, I worked for a standalone agency that was focused solely on economic development. We were not affiliated with a chamber of commerce. We received funding from the state, from the city, from the county, and when we raised private dollars to support the work. And typically the work is what is often referred to as a three-legged stool, and that is recruitment of firms to come into the community that can provide job opportunities and economic development opportunities for the region. This is done typically using the location quotient that we will look at here in a moment. And it's really driven around low-cost competitiveness these days. How accessible is your land? Is it accessible to rail, to air, to highway, interstate highway in particular? Is it close, proximate to supply chains? Are there low costs from the standpoint of transportation, which is the approximation to supply chains? But also, are the utilities and other amenities low cost and competitive? Is the labor low cost? What's the union atmosphere and environment? And does the community and the state offer ways to incentivize them to come by giving tax abatements? And those tax abatements might be over a term of several years that will cut the cost and make it more inviting for them to participate. And there's a lot of pros and cons. The scope of this course, we won't get into the pros and cons very much. We'll talk a little bit about it, but generally speaking, incentives can be a very detrimental thing because it takes money away from tax coffers and gives certain advantages that others don't have the opportunity to share. The second leg of the stool is retention and business retention programs. Most new jobs in any given community are really created by the businesses that are already there by growing or expanding, remaining competitive, remaining in the community. So keeping them in the community, but also allowing them to compete for expansions and to grow their business through the community. A lot of this is done with some of the same tools, the low cost piece, but also the workforce, because they're already there, they're already benefiting from the land and the low costs. One of the main areas are ways that you can partner with higher ed institutions, particularly community colleges and workforce development agencies, to provide a better workforce and a more competitive workforce. The third area is in the formation of new businesses, and this is really an entrepreneurial side of economic development, where sometimes referred to as economic gardening, where you grow businesses in a community. And so this is really creating a startup atmosphere that is typically quite different than the recruitment, the land, the low cost for big firms to come and and land in a community. Business startup really relies on a couple of key factors. One of the key factors is a research and development environment where a lot of ideas are generated. The second key factor is typically having access to capital, having startup money. And the second real generator of jobs in any given place are typically high growth firms that start and then they become gazelles. They become what they call second stage companies. Once you get through the really difficult process of startup in the first stage, that second stage is where jobs are added and that firm becomes a larger firm. Let's take a look at the economic base model that really forms the basis of how economic development and how regional economies function. This is really the oldest regional economic development model, and it's really a demand-led model, although there are some supply side features to it. Geographers will refer to it as basic, the basic type of economy, and that's city region forming activities that provide the basis for their existence in the region. What's the competitive advantage? Is it in some cases the fact that you have access to water, access to interstate highways, or is it the natural resources of the river of the region, like having access to low-cost coal and mines? Non-basic are those activities in a region that are complementary. This would include things that are like grocery stores, restaurants, but also things like law firms, accounting agencies. And those type of jobs, those type of economic activities are really contingent upon having some basic activities or city forming activities in a region. And so we'll differentiate from a geographer standpoint, the basic and the non-basic, and what the ratio of that is. That's really going to form the basis of a location quotient. And economists typically call it the export or base, not the export, or geographers call it base or basic. Economists call it export, and that is money from that activity, from that type of firm flows out and in. Typically, those base activities, those export activities are things like manufacturing, tourism, some healthcare systems that are large and regional, some regional retail where people come from multiple counties around, or a tourist-oriented retail where people come as a destination. And then pension activities, Social Security. If you have a large retirement base, that's an export type of activity as well. Non-base activities are all those kind of services, retail, some of the outpatient medical that goes along to serve the people that live in that area, personal services, and the like. Once again, geographers call it base and non-base, or basic and non-basic. Economists call it export and local. And so the location quotient, the multiplier effects, where you can really kind of figure out what's driving any local economy, is to do this computation to try to figure out what's the ratio of the employment share in a given sector in the community divided by the employment share in that sector nationally. And so what you're trying to figure out is, if you have a larger share of employment in your given region than at the national level, in other words, if your location quotient is above 1, that means you have exported goods, and that means that is a base industry or an export industry in your area. So those jobs really have a much powerful indicator because of the multiplier effect that we're going to look at here in just a moment. And so here is the computation. Don't worry so much about the computation. The big thing is the ratio of below 1 and above 1. And so if it's greater than 1, it's a basic or export employment, and it has the capacity to generate additional employment opportunity. So for example, an export job may result in 0.5, 0.75, or even 1.25 additional jobs created for that one job. And so you look at a manufacturing job in a large sector, like the automotive sector, for example, in Bowling Green, those jobs will create additional jobs to serve those jobs because those are export type of industries. And the multiplier is really like a ripple effect, analogous to the impact of a stone thrown in the pond. The impact is largest at the point of impact, or in the case of this, the export sector diminishes outward through the various local sectors. And so if you look at it from the standpoint of this graphic presentation, the classic regional economy has these base economy sectors that sell goods and services to external markets. Those markets are global and those markets are national. And so the dollars that are coming from the sale of those automobiles out of Bowling Green, or those auto parts out of Bowling Green, are bringing dollars in to the local economy. And so this payment to suppliers and wages to employees and profits to businesses then circulate in the local economy, where those employees will buy homes. They will participate in retail and service activities, and their kids will go to schools. They will pay taxes. And so this really is the interaction between these base economic activities and these local economic activities, as the economists would say, export and non-export. Other sources, of course, include government jobs, transfer payments, retirement savings, pensions, things like that. Those are also what we would consider to be other income sources, but they are in some respects base services. But what we've seen in the last few years with the globalization and the changing nature of the economy is this classic model is faltering a little bit. Natural resources decline or become depleted, or in some cases like coal, there's a move away from that. You also see tourism attractions, particularly as we've seen with the pandemic. People don't spend as much money on it. The appeal of leisure trends change over time, and there are also limits based on the size of the community. Manufacturing also has declined significantly, particularly in the small cities that we've looked at. And so global competition has decreased demand, and you've seen our economy really shift to more service-oriented economy. Agriculture is the same way. It once was a major base industry for most rural or small communities, but the mega farm movement, unless you are in an area where you have really, really big agribusiness operations, in Kentucky, there are some of this in Kentucky, but a lot of it is in states like Iowa and some parts of Illinois, some parts of the Great Plains. And so agriculture has also declined. Retail is becoming less local because of all the online things, but also because a lot of big box national merchants are replacing local merchants, and those local merchants are going out of business. And so the low-cost big box stores, there's not as much money that circulates in the local economy from that. And so ultimately, fewer exports mean less revenue coming back. And this has really been the tale of most small cities in the United States over the last 20 years. And so how you adjust to this as the traditional basic economy sectors look to niche products and services to better differentiate with one another. And the traditional base sectors here, you've seen an emergence of a middle economy where these traditional sectors of the local economy cross the line to appeal to other external markets. And so in many respects, you see this with services, with housing, with retail, with the online retailers. A lot of local retailers are starting to sell their wares using e-commerce. The service economy has really grown because of technology. E-commerce does bolster the local economy, as we've mentioned. And so more and more economic activity is oriented to external markets to sustain and grow a local economy. And so this has become really the way that economic development is done, and that's to try to find ways to cluster around areas that are unique competitive advantages. This is one from just up the road in Owensboro that we worked on around a pretty significant high-tech biotech cluster. This is a company that uses tobacco, and they are, as we speak, developing a vaccine for the coronavirus using tobacco. They've developed the Ebola vaccine using tobacco. And so finding ways to build on this competitive advantage through the healthcare sector, through the Tobacco Research Center at UK, through the James Graham Brown Cancer Center at Louisville, again, taking opportunities to use translational research from universities in cancer and use of tobacco, but also developing the workforce and the local farm community in creating a cluster that's competitive. And so economic development has really moved from just putting up a shingle and recruiting companies into, as the economy's evolved, a much more complex phenomenon as you see here. And so as small cities evolve and change, you're seeing economic activities change pretty significantly and try to remain competitive. But it also has led many of the small cities that we've studied, some of them to flourish and some of them to significantly decline. And so that's part of what we're looking at in the scope of the work we're doing in this course.